So a couple of videos ago, we looked at my full planner lineup, which involves 9 journals that I use for various things. And as part of that, we talked about the frequency with which I use those notebooks, because I don't use every single one of them every single day. In today's video though, I'm going to give you a kind of realistic look at what my notebook use in a week actually looks like. While I didn't record every single instance of me working in my notebooks, because that would have been a little bit hard to achieve, I did make sure to do a check-in in the morning and in the evening. This month I've gone back to daily logging rather than using weekly spreads, so what I'm doing here is writing down my initial kind of brain dump for the first of the month. Of course, this first of the month brain dump doesn't happen every single week, but because I started recording on the first of the month, I got to show you what my start of month kind of journaling looks like as well. So as said, here we're doing a kind of initial brain dump for the day of things that I might need to get done or things that are on my mind. The idea is that everything touches my daily logs first. So rather than having a thought and then having to think, ooh, where in my journaling system should this go, I put it straight down into my daily log, and then at the end of the day or end of the week, depending on what I feel like, I can then migrate those things into their appropriate places. So whether that be my wish list or my future me problems or wherever else. As it's the first of the month, I also want to go back and migrate any tasks that I have in my previous month's pages that either haven't been done or haven't already been migrated. This effectively just involves flipping back and forth in my journal to take things off of my calendar, if there's anything on there, anything off my notes page, which was something that I had in March that I wouldn't necessarily have every month, but something to check in with. And then also going through each of my weekly logs to make sure that there are no open tasks on there, and if they are open, then pulling them forward into this brain dump. At least if they're all in the same place, I then know I don't have to go back and further check over those March pages. And because it's the start of the day and I'm pretty much rearing to go and want to do other stuff, like kind of get into my productiveness space for the day, I don't want to spend mental capacity trying to figure out where things should go right now. If I just put them on this daily log, I can deal with them later. At this stage of the month, I hadn't actually finished doing my goal setting or populating my monthly log, so those are also a couple of things that I either wanted to do today or wanted to do as part of this journaling session in particular. While I don't do a full job of populating my calendar right now, having at least some things that are going on just helped me to feel a little more at ease. Although I want to keep my daily logging fairly simple, really just effectively a list for each day, I know that I am way more likely to use my journal if it looks at least a little bit decorative. So one of the ways that I'm going to be decorating my dailies is just by using some layered washi tape in a couple of spaces on the spreads. But that's our first session done. As said, I did use my journal in between the morning and evening sessions, so you may see a little bit of a difference between where my log was, where we left it, and where it is when we come back. It just wasn't realistic to either keep my camera running all day so I could capture every single time I wrote something down, or turn my camera on and off throughout the day. But hopefully these check-ins are still giving you guys a pretty realistic picture of how I like to use my lineup. Something that I also like to include in my daily logging sections are what I call micro collections, so collections that are very small in nature. For instance, one of the ones I've put on here is my meal log for the week coming, in particular for our dinners, just so I know what's coming up, and then I can also write down tasks associated with that. For instance, defrosting things, getting ingredients, all that kind of thing. When it comes to my end of day check-ins though, my main tasks here are to 1. Fill in anything that did happen that day, so check off tasks that happened, make sure that I've filled in things like my habit tracker and whatnot. At this stage I hadn't actually picked my habits for the month, which isn't typical. I do like to try and pick them before the month starts, but because I haven't been well, it wasn't really a priority. And this intentional journal time also gives me an opportunity to work on anything on my task list that might be specifically related to my journal. For instance, just now I was filling in my content calendar because that's something I need to do in my journal. So given that I have dedicated journaling time, I might as well do it now. Obviously this footage is sped up, but on average each of the journaling sessions that we had for like the AM slot and the PM slot was about 10 to 15 minutes per session, really just depending on how many things I wanted to do in terms of filling stuff out and things. So far we've only seen my everyday journal, but another one that I like to use on a daily basis is my 5-year journal. This one comes out at the end of the day, so during my PM slots, just so that I can write down 3 lines about what happened that day. These could be things like milestones, achievements, challenges, memory making, just general happenings, and I indicate what type of thing I'm recording by using an icon at the start. So instead of just a dot point or like a bullet point, I'll use something like a tick for an achievement, or an exclamation point for a milestone, or a heart for like a social interaction, that kind of thing. As said, because I hadn't figured out what my habits were for April, I didn't fill in my habit tracker in this session, though typically in my PM session I would do that. Onto a new day though, and onto a new daily log. One of the things that some people like to do with their dailies is at the end of each day do a daily migration process where they take all of their open tasks and consider, do I want to migrate this forward to the next day, do I want to schedule it for some other date, or do I want to scrap it completely? You'll note that I'm not doing that here because I find that if I can still see the tasks, if they're still on the same page that I'm working on, I don't mind just having them sit there and be left open. I find it just helps me to feel like I actually know everything that I've got going on, or everything that is kind of currently on my mind in terms of things that I might want to get done, and I don't feel the need to rewrite them on my next day's to-do list when I can still see them sitting there on the same page. I'm also not too fussed about checking things off from previous days when I've done them on subsequent days. The only time that I ever really let this bother me is when I'm using something like the Alistair method, where I can very easily denote that without having to rewrite the task. So for instance, at the moment we're working on the 2nd, but if I do any tasks from the 1st, I'm just going to cross them off on the list from the 1st. I'm not going to rewrite them in my list for the 2nd. You'll see that I'm also putting down some extra pieces of washi tape just as decoration. I decided to put one in particular at the bottom of my meal log just to kind of separate where the meal log was compared to the rest of my task list. And because whenever I put washi tape on my page, I like to do it in 3s, I feel like it makes it look a little bit more balanced, I decided to put some at the bottom as well. Another thing that I've added to the spread is also a little checkbox in the top right hand corner, and that one's going to be necessary for when I do end up migrating the things on this page. Once everything on the page is migrated, I can put a little check in that box to say this page is finished with. But that's going to be a little while off. Because this particular check-in is happening on a Sunday, it means it is time for my weekly reset process. Now, I wouldn't typically write down the steps of my weekly reset on my daily log. I'd usually just refer back to the list that I've got, but I've been super slack about doing my weekly resets this year, so I thought that writing it down might just help me actually get it done. You will have seen me fiddling around with my bookmark at the bottom there though. That's a little bit of foreshadowing for something that's to come, but more on that later notably. Getting into the weekly reset though, we're obviously really only going to look at the parts that involve my planner, because some stages of the weekly reset aren't actually in my notebooks. They're on my computer, like doing my inbox zero or tidying up my office, so in my physical spaces. But I figured for this check-in in particular, I could show you what the process looks like in my notebooks. One of the first things that I like to do in my notebooks for my weekly reset is do a brain dump or mind unwind. Just get all of the ideas and thoughts, tasks, whatever they may be, out of my head and onto the paper. This is just a nice little moment for some mental clarity. If you can actually put everything on the paper, you can look through it a little bit more objectively, help you prioritize stuff, sort into boxes of need to do now versus could be done later. The brain dump also involves going through any of my open tasks and seeing if there are any that need to be moved to other places, any that need to be brought forward into my brain dump, any that could get checked off. I'll also check my calendar, check any plans that I have, and I'll also check other parts of this journal and other journals. In particular, my start of journal collections, because I'm not usually very good at checking in with those, so I use the weekly reset as a way to remind myself to do that. And also my yearly collections journal, where I have other trackers that I like to keep updated. We talked about it more in my full planner lineup, but my yearly collections journal is effectively what it sounds like, a journal for yearly collections. So collections that are tracking things on a year-long basis, whether that be stuff like challenges like the 2323s in 2023, or my goal list like my 101 things list that I'm looking at here. Effectively anything that I'm going to want to use for the entire span of the year, but don't want to have to rewrite in every new everyday journal, because I usually use either 2 or 3 everyday journals every year, and rewriting all of this into each new journal would just kind of feel like a waste of time. or at least a waste of effort when I can use a separate notebook like this one to hold those trackers so I don't have to double up or duplicate them. When it comes to working in this journal for my weekly reset, I'm effectively just going through each of the different trackers and making sure they're up to date. So, have I done any tasks on my 101 things list? Have I completed any more of my 2323s in 2023? So checking that off on the tracker, and then also writing down the details in the pages that follow. If I hadn't already, I'd also fill in what my book for the month was for our book club tracker, and I also fill in my challenge page for my no spend, and my habit builder, which is the page titled "We Are What We Repeatedly Do." As mentioned, part of the planner check-in process for the weekly reset is also looking at my start of journal pages in my everyday journal. This is stuff like going through my future log and pulling out anything that's coming up, or populating anything that is now a future event, running over my actions list for my level 10 life to see if there's anything that I could do in the week coming up, or anything that I have done that I can check off. And I can also have a look at my media list to see if there's anything that I want to add to that in terms of want to read, want to watch, or anything that I have watched, have read, that kind of thing. I know to a lot of people that probably sounds like a lot of stuff to be checking in with on a weekly basis, like it might kind of start to sound like a bit of a cumbersome task, and yes, the weekly reset can take me a while, but I do know how much my week improves because of doing it. I always feel a lot better going into the next week, knowing what I have coming up, knowing what I need to do, where I need to be, all of that kind of thing, from having done this process. You can of course make more simplified versions of the weekly reset process to kind of suit the way that you would like to reset at the end of each week in preparation for the week ahead. We do have a separate video, a separate playlist all about that. Any links to related videos are of course in the description box below. Because this was a PM check-in, we also did a check-in with my 5-year journal, and then after this we're on to day 3, which was Monday the 3rd. As per our previous AM check-ins, the main focus here is to write my task list for the day, so effectively doing a little brain dump at the start of the day so I kind of have that mental clarity that I need to get the rest of my stuff done. I find it really hard to get things done if I constantly have thoughts churning over in my head like, oop, don't forget this, oh, you've got to do that, make sure to go do this thing, go get that. Rather than just let them take up that mental space, writing them in my journal means that I know they're in a safe place, I don't have to worry about forgetting them. Which means my brain can actually just relax a little and let it go. Because I knew that in writing this task list I was going to go over onto the next spread, I decided that on this morning I was going to do a little bit of decoration on the spread that follows, just so that it was all ready to put my tasks in when I needed it. I often find that I like to decorate first and then populate with tasks so that I can work my tasks in amongst the decoration, rather than trying to fit decoration around my tasks later on. Just like the last page though, this was just done with stacked washi tape that I cut on an angle to kind of fit the general theme that all of the pages of my setup have. One of the things that was really important to me on this day was actually deciding on what habits I wanted to track for April. As I said, I do typically like to decide on these before the month starts so I can kind of hit the ground running with them, but due to unwellness I hadn't gotten around to it this month. I know that the longer I leave not having my habits decided on, the less likely I am to ever actually pick them for the month, which effectively just leads to like a month of wasted time. That's not to say that I didn't necessarily do the things, but I like my tracker there for that kind of accountability or that kind of memory jog of, hey, when was the last time I did XYZ? I did decide to palm my habits back a little bit for the month of April, so usually I track somewhere between like 12 to 19 habits. Mind you, these aren't new habits that I'm trying to build. I'm not trying to build 19 new habits a month. That would be a little bit excessive, at least for me. But they are things that I want to keep track of me doing. Some of the things I put on my habit tracker though, I don't actually really need to track, if I'm completely honest. They're things that are going to happen anyway, so putting them on the habit tracker is more just for the kind of little dopamine kick of, hey look, you did the thing, but I was always going to do it, so it doesn't really need to be on the habit tracker. Anywho, for April though, I have decided to, as said, par back. I'm only tracking 4 habits. While I hadn't quite decided on the full 4 when it came to doing the PM session for this day, I'm pretty sure it was the next day that I decided what that 4th habit was. While I only actively use my everyday journal and my 5-year journal every single day, I actually found that through this week in particular, I checked in with my yearly collections a lot more than I usually would. It's probably in part because actually having to film me filling in my journals kind of holds me a little bit more accountable to actually getting into them. But I do try to check in with it semi-regularly because I have a daily tracker in here, or a year-long challenge that I need to track something every day. Because one of my goals for this quarter is building financial health, one of the action steps or daily habits that I have associated with that is making sure that I'm actually filling in my no-spend tracker. I can usually go a couple of days without filling it in and remember quite accurately whether I did or didn't break the no-spend, but so that the data can be as accurate as possible, filling it in on the day is a lot more helpful. One of the things that does make filling in all of these different planners easier is limiting the number of supplies that I'm using. For April in particular, my color palette is black and grey, and these are also the pens that I'm already using in my yearly collections journal. So my black and grey dot pens, and then just a black everyday writing pen. My writing pen of choice being the Papermate Inkjoy pen. Although I'm going between all these different planners, because I'm effectively only using one or a couple of pens to fill them all in, it makes the process less daunting. I don't have to get out like a bunch of supplies every time I want to work in a particular journal, which would certainly be something that would hold me back from filling in that journal more. For instance, last year, when I was filling in my yearly collections, I had a set of about, I think, 5 or 6 different colored pens that I was using to fill in daily trackers, which meant that I had to keep those pens outside of my regular pen storage for the entire year, because otherwise I'd forget which colors they were, and because I was using them on a pretty much daily basis in theory, I didn't see the point of putting them away to get them back out every day. It just became a little bit annoying to have those pens sitting out of my regular collection for the entire year. So this year, when I picked my color palette for my yearly collections in particular, I made sure to pick ones that I didn't mind having out for the whole year, and also a palette that had way less pens. In this AM segment though, you'll see we're checking in with a couple of different pages. So we checked in with the actions list to add a couple of steps to that. Again, this is another one that I usually prefer to have filled before the month starts, but didn't quite happen for April. And I'm also checking in with my monthly reflection, which you'd think would get more populated towards the end of the month, not on day 4, but I do try and populate this as the month progresses. Otherwise, I have to try and remember a full month's worth of reflection things at the end of the month, which my brain isn't very good at doing. Much easier to fill it in as I go, like as I have the thoughts. Taking a look at a different journal to any of the ones we've seen so far in this video, this one is my social media journal where I like to record things like my analytics, write down content ideas. In particular, the one I'm filling in today is my reshare list, because I like to reshare one video per week that's relevant for the time of year. One of my tasks from the day had been to organize that, so a check-in was necessary. As we talked about in my journal lineup video, my social media journal is probably the one that I would be most willing to sacrifice if I had to get rid of a journal. Not that I have to, so I'm not going to, but it's very much the journal that I'm kind of watching to see how much I do end up using it this year, so that at the end of the year I can decide if I want to continue with it. One of the biggest issues that I have when it comes to kind of, I guess you could say, like abandoning a planner or abandoning a notebook, is kind of like the sunk cost into either like setting it up or having paid for it, the materials used, all of that kind of thing. So I don't want to feel like those things were a waste, but if I'm not using the journal, then would it not be better to move on to something that either is working to do the function that I want it to do, or repurpose that journal in some way so that I can use it for something else? More often than not, if my journals get repurposed, they get turned into R&D bullet journals or research and development journals, which are the ones that I use for making idea videos for the channel, rather than turning them into a different type of notebook that I will actually use for my own personal planning. Because the only time I've done that, it bothered me that the stuff that I was setting up started in the middle of the notebook, whereas I would have liked to have it start at the start of the notebook. And actually that was for my last content journal. I had tried to repurpose a previous journal and turn that into my content planner, and it hadn't really worked out, and I thought that was mainly because I was starting in the middle of the notebook, but it may have just in part been because I don't really feel the need to check in with this type of journal, or a journal with this type of content. As said, it's something that I'm kind of watching out for, so I can see if I really want to continue using this notebook come the end of the year. But the plan is to use it for now. You'll have seen for our PM session, I've already checked in with my everyday journal, my 5-year journal, and my yearly collections journal, and then I actually bought the social media journal back out because I needed to calculate the changes in my statistics. This is something I'd kind of been putting off, and actually getting in to use it in the morning session had reminded me that I needed to do this. So I figured I'd do it in the PM session. These pages, along with the weekly reshare list page that we had in the AM session, are the ones that I mainly use in this notebook, which is kind of why I'm contemplating why I need to have a fully separate notebook for these things. Like, technically, all of that stuff could go in my yearly collections journal, so that is a possible solution that I could explore at the end of the year. For now though, we're just gonna keep on putting it in here because the pages are already set up. Headed into day 5 though, which was Wednesday the 5th, which is of course the day of Bujo Wednesday, which is a regular kind of meetup that my friends and I have to just work in our journals, catch up, that kind of thing. Originally it was just my best friend Rachel and I, but we have also convinced our friend Scotty to get involved too, so now we kind of rotate between the 3 houses. On this evening in particular, we went to Scotty's place for hanging out and doing journal things. But first, we're doing our AM session. A not so typical part of this morning check-in in particular was flipping back to my habit tracker and actually making a correction, because I decided that although I had said that I had leisure time the day before, realistically, it was not leisure time, it was just a kind of regularly scheduled break, like watching telly with dinner kind of a thing. It wasn't actually a kind of fill my cup leisure activity. So I decided to change that one to a black dot. Thankfully, going from a grey to a black dot is much simpler than the other way around, and come the PM session, I actually did decide to change the way I was recording things on my habit tracker so that this would be less likely to happen again. When it comes to tracking leisure time in particular, I am often way too lenient on myself as to what constitutes leisure time. Often I'm like, oh, you scrolled through Instagram reels for 5 minutes, that counts as leisure, right? No, that's just me getting distracted from my work for one reason or another. That is not genuine, intentional leisure time, which is what I want to be tracking. The thing that I've decided to do to hold myself a little bit more accountable to that is actually write what the leisure activity was, beside checking off whether I had leisure time. I figured there was enough space on my habit tracker to record this, so I might as well use that space. And it also saves me from thinking that I need to make up more habits to put on my habit tracker to fill in the space. I don't know if anybody else suffers from that. I very much certainly do, because a lot of the time I set up my bullet journal for the month ahead way before the month starts, so you know that I can record it, edit it, get it out so people can use it as inspiration if they want to, all of that kind of thing. But that means that often I need to put in a space for my habits before I know what habits I'm going to be tracking, or before I know how many habits I'm going to be tracking, which can sometimes lead to either not enough space, but more often than not, I overcompensate, I guess, and give myself way more room than I otherwise probably need. For instance, this month where I only have 4 habits, but enough space to track like 18 or something like that. It's also good to note that while in this video I have an AM and a PM session for every day of the full week, that isn't necessarily what happens every week. As we kind of talked about before, having to film my journaling process effectively held me accountable to actually using it, and getting into each of them, filling things in. So there certainly are days that I either just don't have a journaling session in the evening. For instance, I'm pretty sure the day after I finished filming this video was one of those days. Or I might not check in with my habit tracker, I might not check in with my 5-year journal, but I do try to make sure that the next day I make a conscious effort to get back into it. Because not using your journal 2 days in a row is the start of a new habit, and not a habit that I want to have. Historically speaking, Thursday is my energy slump day. In terms of my natural weekly energy cycle, Thursday is the day that my energy is typically at its lowest, which is part of the reason why our morning check-in for this day was a little bit shorter than others, but also because the day prior, and actually a couple of days prior to that, I was just finding it super hard to get into my work and concentrate and do the things that I needed to do. It meant that I didn't want to spend too much time in my journal that morning, writing out a list of stuff that I needed to get done, when I knew exactly what I needed to get done, and that was finishing off the video that was supposed to come out on Thursday but actually came out on Friday. There are many factors that go into how much time I spend in my journals on any given day, but because my morning check-in had been shorter, I wanted to spend a little bit more time in my journal in the evening. And one of the things that I'd kind of been putting off that I thought might be a nice unwind task for myself in the evening was swatching my new calligraph pens from Archer & Olive. They've just been sitting on my desk, kind of staring at me and being like, Jess, swatch us. Put us in your swatch book. So I figured I could do that in this video too. Plus, it's something that I would do in my journals on any given week. Not every week, I'm not buying pens every single week, but it is not atypical for me to get into my long-term collections journal and do something in there. If not every week, then maybe every second week, a couple times a month, that kind of thing. Honestly, most of the time that I jump into my long-term collections journal, it's not necessarily to put anything in there, it's to reference the stuff that I already have in there. My color swatches in particular are ones that I like to look at quite a lot, so when I'm planning out a monthly setup or any setup, I like to go through my pen colors to see which materials I might want to use and which ones won't be suitable. For my calligraph swatches, you'll see I have 2 columns to swatch in for each of the sets of pens. That's because the calligraphs are double-ended and sometimes the different ends have different colors, so I like to put both of them on here. Unfortunately, I didn't think to mark in which end is the smaller and which one is the thicker end. Probably should have done that. Probably when I started the spread, but at least I know which pen to look for if I want a certain color. I then just have to figure out which end the color comes from. Goodbye long-term collections journal and hello Friday. Now, when it came to doing our AM session for this day, it was becoming apparent that I was getting towards the end of this spread and I was going to need to turn over and move on to the next one. This meant a few things. 1, I would want some decoration, so we're gonna need to get those washi tapes out again. And 2, I also might need to think about doing some migration. While I don't mind looking across 2 spreads of tasks for getting stuff done, I don't really like having to flip between 3 full spreads of tasks. So the one we're working on here, the next one that I'm about to work on, and the one that came before. That's just a little bit too much for me. So as said, migration was in order. The migration process is fairly simple. You're just going through each of the tasks that you have on your list, the ones that haven't been completely checked off, and you're considering, where does this task need to go? Does it need to be scheduled and put on like my monthly log or future log or something like that? Can it just be brought forward into my current daily list? Or does it need to go somewhere else? For instance, a wish list kind of collection, or a shopping list, or wherever you like to put things. For me, the main places that stuff are going to go are either on my daily checklist, because they're things that I want to get done either today or in the very soon future, or they're going to go on my future me problems. My future me problems is effectively what it sounds like. It's a list of things that I want to do, but they're not for me to do right now. They're probably not even for me to do this month. They're at some point tasks. These could be things like adding different collections to my long-term collections journal, or home projects that I don't have the time or capacity to do right now, or really whatever else I can't do right now, don't want to do in this season of life, I suppose, but I do want to do at some stage, or I do want to investigate, or might want to investigate at some stage. My future me problems list lives in my yearly collections journal because I didn't want to have to migrate it with each new everyday journal that I make, but having a future me problems list for a year seems like a good amount of time. I don't want to put it in my long-term collections journal because I like the idea of being able to review the list at least once a year to kind of go back, prune through it, get rid of stuff that isn't relevant anymore, and if I had it in my long-term collections journal, I'd be way less inclined to actually do that process. This is a new strategy for me this year. Previously, my future me problems lists were just in my everyday journal, but then we had the aforementioned issue of having to move it into each subsequent journal, which was just way too much rewriting. It seems to be working well in my yearly collection so far. For our migration process, I'm not looking at all of the spreads that I've already filled in. I'm really just looking at that first spread that we did as part of this week in my journal. so the first few days of April, and the things that I wrote down in those daily logs. Once that page is completely done with though, we can then tick off that little box in the top right corner to say that this page has been dealt with. There's no outstanding tasks in here, no information that I need to go back and remember or pull out, because it's already been put somewhere else, somewhere that I am more likely to reference on a more regular basis. In my lineup, I have 9 notebooks, so my brainstorming book, long-term collections, R&D bujo, self-care journal, everyday journal, 5-year journal, social media journal, yearly collections, and a notes book. As you saw, in any given week, I don't necessarily use all 9 of those journals. For instance, I didn't have anything to write down in my self-care journal this week, so it didn't get used. It's also very personal, so I wouldn't have put it on camera anyway, but that aside, I also didn't really use my R&D bullet journal. And while I did use my notes journal, that one was done during the middle of the day, not as part of my AM or PM check-ins, and it was really just taking notes. Hopefully you appreciated this look into my journaling practice though, and what it looks like on a fairly typical week. If you wanted to see more of this kind of journal with me, or what it's really like to be in my journal content, then I'd recommend checking out one of our previous month of planning series, where I've done a video each day in my planner showing you how I use it. But if you'd like to see more content specifically like this video, let me know in the comments. Until next time, bye!